This September has been marked by acts of violence across our country. Two high-profile attacks being the stabbing of a Ukrainian immigrant on a Charlotte bus and the shooting of political activist Charlie Kirk, both where the victims died from their injuries.
The suspect in the Charlotte bus attack had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, sparking conversation on the link between mental health concerns and violent crimes. I spoke with local criminal psychologist Benjamin Sibler about these incidents and if enough is being done to get people the help they need.
I think that there's a broad range of ways in which a person's mental health might in some way result in violence or may relate to aggressive behavior. The two that you mentioned, I think, are probably quite different in some of the mental health issues that those individuals may or may not have. I have no direct experience with either one of those cases, but I do know from what I've read so far that the case in Charlotte, for example, that individual had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. It's my understanding that they had reportedly had some delusions. One of the delusions he reportedly had was he believed that the victim in the case had been reading his thoughts. He also believed that there was a microchip that had been implanted in him. He also believed that there was material, some sort of man-made material that was controlling his body, either his appetite or his eating habits, his behavior, and other things like that. So we would call those paranoid or persecutory delusions, which is commonly an aspect of schizophrenia. Often if a person has delusions like that, they're going to experience a sense of threat. They feel like they are being under attack, they are being harmed in some way, even when they're actually not. And often, some of the people that I've worked with those exact same sorts of delusions never engage in any violent behavior. So it doesn't always result in or predict violent behavior. But when a person feels that they are being harmed or will be harmed, then some people will act out in a manner that they see as self-defense, even though the rest of the world, of course, will not see it as an act of defense. But for that person within that moment and in their mental state, they may see it as an act of defense. And there we would, of course, have a very direct connection between their mental health and the act of violence.
And of course, given the schizophrenia diagnosis in that case out of Charlotte, that one has really transformed the way that we're talking about mental health and we're talking about crime and the relationship to it within the past couple of weeks. Does this signal that there needs to be some sort of a more structured process for help for those individuals that may have schizophrenia or another mental illness?
I think it is a good illustration of that. I've heard from the mother in that case that they had tried to get him civilly committed through a psychiatric hospitalization, but the way our laws work, and this is the same thing in Arkansas, is if a person doesn't agree to psychiatric hospitalization, they can only be involuntarily committed if they're a danger to self or others. And most of the time, you can't prove it. You know, when they're looking at whether or not the person's a danger, they're looking at acute, imminent risk. So in other words, if we don't think that person's about to hurt themselves or someone else in the next few days, they can't be hospitalized. And that's what happened to him. They were able to get him, I think, a 14-day hospitalization through a magistrate, but then of course they discharge him and he goes right back to not taking his medication. There's something we call anosognosia, or we'll sometimes refer to as a lack of insight. But for people with serious mental illness, like schizophrenia, it is very common for them to not just not think that they have a mental health problem, they are actually incapable of recognizing they have a mental health problem. You can explain to them, you can educate them. A lot of them are unable to see the deficits, even though it's very clear to others, the symptoms, the impairments. For that person, they can't see it. So how would you convince that person on their own to be hospitalized or to take medication? And it's very hard. And so that's where we see a need to, I think, probably have some policy changes where we start expanding the care that's available and the ways that we can sort of kind of bring these people into a treatment program when they don't recognize the need for themselves.
These incidents have sparked a conversation about the dangerous real-world consequences of social media, especially for those with mental health issues.
Silber spoke about the dangers of echo chambers created by social media algorithms.
I read a lot of research, and generally the research on social media and the internet and mental health is almost always negative. There's not a lot of positive outcomes for a lot of the research that we look at. So yeah, false information, fake news, as some people would call it, and now of course we have AI generation of videos and images that are entirely fabricated, does influence the way that people are starting to see the world. The algorithms, of course, shape what we see. We get these echo chambers, and especially when you have certain groups, and this could be on social media platforms or other sort of platforms online that allow for groups of like-minded individuals to come together, you'll see increasing extremism, some radicalization through the internet, because you have people who have these same beliefs. They often have this sense of grievance toward another group. They feel like their community is somehow wronged by an outside group or individual community. And of course, the distortions that they're getting through the media is going to further enhance that, and they're going to use that and share it with each other. The most extreme voices are often the loudest, and those are often the most influential. And you might have a group of 100 people, and most of them will never act on any of that, but it just takes a couple within that group who actually will eventually take those steps, and of course then it becomes very problematic.
And there's a lot of sort of dark web networks, if you will, that encourages teens, youth, maybe even adults to inflict harm on others, inflict harm on themselves too. Is this a concern to you? Have you seen many cases about this?
It is a concern to me, yes. And actually, we look at, there's a whole sort of subsection within forensic psychology that focuses on threat assessment. Threat assessment is usually predicting things like a school shooting, a workplace shooting, things of that nature. And we often will specifically look at social media engagement because it's really important. And that's often where the radicalization takes place. A lot of these individuals have limited in-person relationships. They're fairly isolated socially. A lot of the relationships are coming from individuals in a very selective group online. And of course, those people are kind of pushing this person more and more extreme in a certain direction. I mean, I think that it's really important that we start teaching kids, especially critical thinking skills, teaching them how to escape the echo chamber, maybe getting some distance from social media, understanding the algorithm and how it works, understanding how groupthink works, understanding things like black and white thinking, because these are all things that we're susceptible to, and it ultimately does result in increases in violence for some individuals. So I think providing more education is going to be helpful in preventing those things in the future.